Ichthyosaurs were a fascinating lineage of extinct marine reptiles that lived during the time of the dinosaurs. These animals evolved from land-living ancestors over 250 million years ago, and rapidly became key components of the Mesozoic oceans. Although they are most well known as being very similar to modern dolphins in their outward appearance, the result of convergent evolution as both groups adapted to life in the water, the ichthyosaurs were remarkably diverse and weren't all small-bodied dolphin mimics. The first large-bodied oceanic superpredators were ichthyosaurs that lived near the start of the Triassic period, and then later on in the Triassic there appeared some truly gigantic species, ichthyosaurs called shastosaurids. The shastosaurids are named for Shastosaurus pacificus, found in California, and include other species such as the huge Shonisaurus popularis from Nevada, which may have reached around 16 meters in length or about 52.5 feet, and the even larger Shonisaurus sicaniensis found in British Columbia, which measures 21 meters, nearly 70 feet. However, tantalizing clues have been uncovered in recent years, hinting at the existence of shastosaurids that may have been even bigger than this. In 2016, a large and isolated fragment from the back of a lower jaw was found on a beach in the English county of Somerset, near a place called Lilstock. This jaw piece was nearly a meter in length and remarkably robust. However, it was missing much of the rest of its length, only preserving the backmost section, so it would have been even larger originally. The Lilstock specimen was recognised as being very similar in overall shape to the same bone in Shonisaurus sicaniensis from Canada, and therefore it was realised to have likely come from a shastosaurid ichthyosaur. But it was much bigger than these same bones in the more complete Shonisaurus specimens. The Lilstock specimen is a bone called the surangula, and it would have been positioned right at the back of the left jaw, above the angular and overlapped by the dentary further forwards. This bone is not often preserved well in large shastosaurids, and they're pretty rare as 3D isolated fossils. Fortunately though, the surangula has quite a few distinct features that allowed paleontologists to realise what it was, and that it most probably came from a shastosaurid. Paleontologist Dr. Dean Lomax, along with colleagues including the original discoverer of the bone, Paul de la Salle, described the Lilstock bone in 2018. They identified anatomical features such as a prominent groove along the length of the bone called the Machelian Canal, where nerves, blood vessels, and cartilage would have been housed, plus sites along the top surface where major jaw muscles would have been anchored. They then compared the bone to the same ones in Shonisaurus popularis and Shonisaurus sicaniensis, in order to try to estimate the potential size of the Lilstock ichthyosaur. Shonisaurus sicaniensis, known from most of the skull and a partial skeleton housed in the Royal Tyrrell Museum, has an estimated total length of 21 meters, but the Lilstock surangula was found to be around 25% larger than the bone in the specimen. Using simple scaling then, this would suggest a total body length for the Lilstock ichthyosaur of up to 26 meters, approaching the maximum confirmed lengths for blue whales of just over 30 meters. So we may not have a 25-meter Liopleurodon, but we do have 25-meter long ichthyosaurs. How the turntables. However, the paleontologists also cautioned that these estimates are speculative due to the limited material known for the Lilstock ichthyosaur, plus the fact that Shonisaurus sicaniensis doesn't have a complete skull, and because the snout length of shastosaurids can be quite variable, as illustrated by the very short-snouted Guanlingsaurus from the late Triassic of China. Indeed, they also scaled up the Lilstock bone using a different, smaller shastosaurid called Basanosaurus, which is known from Italy and Switzerland and reached about 5.4 meters long. Using this species, the size of the Lilstock ichthyosaur came to 22 meters. Nevertheless, the Lilstock animal was clearly massive, and so a total length estimate of 20 to 25 meters was accepted as reasonable. However, the discovery of the Lilstock bone also led paleontologists to realise that some other fossil finds made as long ago as the 1840s could be more evidence of giant shastosaurids. 5 bones recovered during the 19th and 20th centuries from Orst Cliff in Gloucestershire, where the Severn Bridge crosses over to Wales, had been causing confusion for paleontologists over the years as they tried to work out what sort of prehistoric reptiles they had come from. 2 of the bones were unfortunately destroyed when Bristol, where they were housed, was bombed in 1940, but the 3 surviving bones were suggested by paleontologists in the early 2000s to possibly be dinosaurian in origin. They were thought to have been from a sauropodomorph or even stegosaurian dinosaurs, which would make them by far the oldest records of this dinosaur lineage, and they do indeed look robust enough to be sections from the leg bones of these dinosaurs. However, now having the more complete Lilstock specimen for context, it became clear that the Orst bones were most likely of an ichthyosaurian origin instead. The largest of these Orst bones was identified as most probably being a fragment from a Sarangula as well, due to the presence of a shallow groove that looks similar to the elongated shallow grooves found on the Lilstock bone along the sections further towards the front. The very exciting thing is though that if this Orst bone fragment is indeed a piece of Sarangula, then it's absolutely huge, even larger than the Lilstock specimen. Scaling up this bone therefore results in an animal that was 30% larger than the Lilstock ichthyosaur, which, if we go by the maximum 26 meter estimate for that animal, means that the Orst ichthyosaur may have been over 33 meters in length. So about the size of the maximum values recorded for blue whales, and possibly slightly larger. However, again, the researchers stress that these estimates are very rough and based on incredibly fragmentary remains. So while it's very exciting to think about the possibility of ichthyosaurs being bigger than blue whales, and therefore potentially the largest animals that have ever existed, it's also important to remember that we cannot yet be completely certain about them. Now, I actually recently got the chance to catch up with Dr. Dean Lomax, the paleontologist who led the paper describing these giant ichthyosaur bones, and to ask him a few questions about these amazing marine reptiles. So I'm here with Dr. Dean Lomax, and we're here in Lyme Regis, a very appropriate place to talk about ichthyosaurs. So I was just going to ask you, it must have been an amazing discovery finding these first, the Orst Cliff bones and everything, and realising that these animals could have been as big, if not bigger, than a blue whale. So do you think they've kind of almost redefined the history of life in a way, now that we know that these giant animals were living all these millions of years ago? We used to think that whales were the biggest that animals could get, but now we know there's evidence that they were that big in the Triassic.
Yeah, definitely, Ben. It's a good question. And it's one of the things for a long time now, working 16 years on ichthyosaurs and studying thousands of specimens, I've always thought that if one day, potentially, a blue whale maybe kind of kicked off as the contenders, the longest animal ever or whatever, especially in the oceans, if we ignore sauropods and that for a second, I think, definitely that kind of group of ichthyosaurs, Shastasaurids or whatnot, that's what I'm hoping that, it could be with more discoveries, we could hopefully work out definitively that, they were that big. And I mean, based on our work at the moment, looking at the giant jaw bones, the Sarangulas, and the Orst bones especially, it puts it up there 25, 30 plus meters, which is truly, incredible. Yeah. Massive.
So the Orst and Lilstock bones were incredibly exciting, tantalizing finds. But recently, a new study was published in April of 2024 announcing the discovery of another specimen of enormous ichthyosaur bone from nearby to Lilstock. And they've officially named this giant marine reptile as a new species. Meet Ichthyotitan severnensis, the largest marine reptile to have ever existed that we currently know of. So how were the new bones that you've based Ichthyotitan on, how were they discovered?
Yeah, so the first one was found in 2016 by a fossil collector and amateur paleontologist, Paul de la Salle. So he reached out to me, he's a long-time friend of mine. He reached out to me and said, hey, I've got these bones. I'm like, oh, this is really interesting. It's clearly an ichthyosaur bone. And then he found other chunks of it. And then we had the incomplete bone, but it's about a meter long of that Sarangula. And then we published our first paper in 2018 describing that one, redescribing the Orst bones, working out that actually they're not dinosaur limb bones, it's not a humerus, it's not a femur, as has been thought for 150 years. Turns out they are, in fact, giant jaw bones too. And then as a result of that, we were keeping our fingers crossed that we'd find more of giant jaw bones of ichthyosaurs. And then in 2020, up pops an email from somebody called Justin Reynolds, and he and his daughter, Ruby Reynolds, they'd found more chunks of another jawbone, which they'd worked out was another Sarangula. And then we managed to go to the site multiple times, find more of this bone, and that was more complete. In fact, in this case, would have been probably over 2 meters long. Wow. Truly a beast of an ichthyosaur. And so now we had two, and so looking at the Orst bones, looking at all the other ichthyosaurs and stuff of that time, it's clearly something quite unusual and unique.
As Dean mentioned, the second bone is another Sarangula, from the back of the right lower jaw, and it was discovered in multiple pieces between 2020 and 2022 on the foreshore at a place called Blue Anchor, a little further west along the coastline of Somerset from Lilstock. Justin Reynolds and his daughter Ruby, who discovered the first pieces of this bone, are also both included as authors on the paper. Studying the anatomical features of the blue anchor specimen, Dean Lomax and colleagues found that it was almost identical to the Lilstock Sarangula, except this one was more complete. It has the same curving up and flared out section at the back of the bone, displays the same prominent groove along the inner side, and shows the same features of the muscle attachment points, such as a notable ridge running from the top side down to about the middle of the bone. The bone is also of a pretty similar size to the Lilstock specimen, with a total preserved length when all the different fragments are lined up next to each other of 1.45 meters. However, the complete bone would likely have been over 2 meters in length, meaning that the skull of this ichthyosaur was absolutely giant, and when the front of the snout is taken into account too, would have been even longer than 2 meters. So, given that many of the same anatomical features were observed in both the Lilstock and the blue anchor Sarangulas, and the fact that some of these features differ from those observed in other large Shastosaurid Sarangulas, there's a good case here for the recognition of a new species. Therefore, the more complete and better preserved blue anchor Sarangula has been designated as the holotype of the new species Ichthyotitan, a holotype being the key single specimen that the description of a new species is based on. The Lilstock specimen is also referred to the species, and together they show that a distinctive giant ichthyosaur species was swimming through the latest Triassic seas over what would one day become Britain. Ichthyotitan severnensis translates to giant fish lizard of the Severn, and is a perfect descriptive name for this mysterious giant reptile. It's considered to be a Shastosaurid ichthyosaur, going by the very large size of the animal and also because it lived at the end of the Triassic period, when these ichthyosaurs were around. Since the new Sarangula is of a similar size to the Lilstock specimen, the size estimates for this animal have not changed significantly and it's still considered to range between 20 to 26 meters in length, assuming a similar body shape to other large Shastosaurids, since the exact body plan and proportions of different parts of the body of Ichthyotitan cannot yet be known for certain. The Orst bones, which may hint at even larger ichthyosaurs, are not included as being a part of this species since they are very incomplete and don't have all of the diagnostic features listed for Ichthyotitan, and therefore cannot be assigned with confidence. They are also slightly geologically older than the Lilstock and blue anchor bones, and so there's a chance that they do not come from the exact same species, but perhaps something very similar. They do still provide a tantalizing hint at the existence of Ichthyotitan individuals or related ichthyosaurs, reaching more than 30 meters in length though. Another very large ichthyosaur bone has also been uncovered from latest Triassic aged rocks in France, and was discussed in the 2018 paper describing the Lilstock bone. Although it had initially been thought to be a fused mandible, this specimen was identified as another large Sarangula, again displaying that prominent groove of the Maquilian canal and having an expanded region at the back of the bone. However, due to the poorer preservation of the bone, the other diagnostic features of Ichthyotitan cannot be recognised. So despite not being assigned to the new species, it does provide another example of the presence of giant Shastosaurids at the end of the Triassic period. Another fascinating aspect of this new research is the analysis of the internal structure of the bones of these jaws. Another very recent paper has looked at thin sections of Shastosaurid jaw bones and found some very interesting distinctive features of the bone microstructure shared among these ichthyosaurs. Surveying the jaws of Shonisaurus sicaniensis from Canada, as well as the Lilstock and Orst specimens, plus other fragmentary bones found in France and Germany, the paleontologists found that there were consistent, unique combinations of bone anatomy present in all these specimens. Therefore, despite the limited anatomical features on the more complete bones, they can now all be fairly confidently said to be from giant Shastosaurids, as they all share these combinations of microstructures which are not seen in dinosaur bones or other kinds of late Triassic animals. The presence of a unique type of bone structure called intrinsic fiber matrix in all these giant Shastosaurids also shows that this group of ichthyosaurs had a particular way of forming bone in their lower jaws, which may have something to do with strengthening these elements as they grew to reach giant sizes. Comparing the bone structure of the blue anchor specimen to these other bones, in a study naming Ichthyotitan, the paleontologists found that it also shows these characteristic features that appear to be unique to giant Shastosaurids, adding more support to the identification of those other fragmentary bones. Not only that, but the bone also shows signs that it was not finished growing at the time of this animal's death. Even though this was a very large bone from a huge animal, there are clear signs that more bone was continuing to be deposited and that the rate of growth was not slowing down when the individual died. This means that the size estimates for the blue anchor specimen, which is around the same size as the Lilstock bone, are for an ichthyosaur at the subadult or early adult growth stage. So that's pretty incredible when you think that this marine reptile was potentially around 25 meters long and still growing. It also might mean that the even larger Orst bones are from a fully grown Ichthyotitan, but again at the moment there's no way to be certain that they represent the same species. Ichthyotitan was therefore undoubtedly a very large animal, even with the variability in its size estimates depending on which other ichthyosaur species it's scaled with, and the Orst bones might represent the biggest ichthyosaur known if we accept the upper estimates for Ichthyotitan. This could also mean that the Orst specimens represent the largest marine reptile and potentially the largest animal that has ever existed, as far as we can currently tell from the fossil record. It's also important to keep in mind that the nature of the fossil record means that it's very unlikely that these bones came from a record-breaking Ichthyotitan that was the largest individual to have ever lived. Since these animals would very rarely ever be preserved as fossils, we must assume that the remains we do have came from an average-sized individual of the species, based on the limited data we have. Therefore, this means that there's always the potential for the existence of an exceptionally huge individual Ichthyotitan, which would have been larger than the record-breaking 33 to 34 meter long blue whales. Unfortunately, there's just no way to be sure of its existence, unless such an individual were to be found as a fossil, which is just incredibly unlikely.
And so, what do you think an animal of this size would have been feeding on? What could have sustained it at that time?
Yeah, see, that's one of the weird things that me and my team, we had some big discussions about, especially with Marcello Perillo. So Marcello, he'd worked quite a lot with Martin Sander, who's described quite a lot of ichthyosaurs, some big ones recently, the big Symbospondylus from the earlier Triassic. And of course, for us, we don't have any teeth preserved yet in any of these specimens. We don't have that portion preserved. And even looking at, say, Shonisaurus icaniensis, the big 21 meter skeleton that's up in the Royal Tyrrell Museum, found in British Columbia, that doesn't have that portion of the snout either. So it's one of these tantalizing things. We're like, what did it actually eat? I mean, in my opinion, I think it's top of the food chain predator. I think when we do get there, or hopefully we'll at some point down the line, I think we'll find massive teeth. And we know from other recent discoveries from the Swiss Alps that we've got at roughly the same time in the Riesch, the latest Triassic, you've got teeth like that, and of an ichthyosaur. So it's very clearly, in my opinion, that they probably do match up. And so I think to sustain that, I think you're looking at eating lots of squids, eating fish, but also eating other big marine reptiles.
As well as the Ichthyotitan and the previously mentioned Shonisaurus and Shastasaurus, there are some other very interesting fossil finds hinting at enormous Shastasaurids that have been described recently, such as discoveries made in Switzerland. A partial tooth found in Triassic rocks in Switzerland, along with some partial skeletons, represents the largest ichthyosaur tooth so far discovered. It suggests more Shastasaurid species on the same scale as Shonisaurus, and also confirms that these giants definitely had teeth and were not toothless as had been thought before. Since ichthyosaur teeth sit in grooves, not sockets, their dentition often gets lost after death as they are usually not strongly anchored in the jaws. And so previous finds of toothless Shastasaurids had made paleontologists think that these animals were potentially just suction feeders. However, the discovery of teeth in these animals indicates otherwise. Another giant probable Shastasaurid is the species Himalayasaurus tibetensis, named in 1972 based on a partial skull and skeleton uncovered in late Triassic rocks in Tibet. This species has some very large blade-like cutting teeth and was likely on the same sort of scale as Shonisaurus, at around 15 meters in estimated length, but wasn't confirmed as being a Shastasaurid until 1999, though recent studies have still not fully resolved its evolutionary relationships. The unusual dentition of this very large ichthyosaur suggests that it was suited to slicing through flesh, and therefore was likely a macropredator of other marine reptiles. Very fragmentary remains of other large Shastasaurids have been identified from New Caledonia too, which have been assigned to Shonisaurus, although their exact affinity is uncertain. Then there's also a partial skeleton from another very large Triassic ichthyosaur uncovered in Alaska that preserves stomach contents. This ichthyosaur was big-bodied and was found to likely be related to Shastasaurids, and its last meal included fish and cephalopods, going by the remains of fish bones and scales, plus shell fragments from cephalopod mollusks found in its body cavity. This indicates that at least some of these ichthyosaurs were potentially fairly generalist feeders too, going after whatever fish or invertebrate prey they could find. Another fascinating shastosaurid is the species Ichthyosaurus tanjae, named in 2000 and known from fossils found in China. Specimens of this animal are usually found to measure between 5 and 9 meters in length. However, there apparently exists even larger undescribed specimens in private collections, including one that is said to reach 25 meters in length, according to a paper preprint. However, the line about this 25-meter specimen was actually removed in the peer-reviewed published version of the paper, and there is some doubt of whether the specimen really exists or if it was just a mistake in the preprint. Hopefully one day we can get clarification about this, but for now this tantalizing sentence in a paper preprint is all we know about this possible giant. Ichthyosaurus is particularly remarkable for another reason, as there exists a fossil of a nearly 5-meter long individual of this ichthyosaur species, which is preserved with the remains of another 4-meter long marine reptile in its body cavity. This Ichthyosaurus appears to have actively preyed upon this other animal, a kind of reptile called a thalattosaur, and then swallowed the body in very few pieces, as in the position of the ichthyosaur's stomach there is the complete trunk of the thalattosaur, just missing the head and the tail, though a tail possibly belonging to the same thalattosaur was found about 23 meters away from the ichthyosaur. Interestingly, Ichthyosaurus doesn't have teeth that appear particularly suited to feeding on other large marine reptiles, instead looking more like they'd be used for grasping smaller prey, such as soft-bodied cephalopods and fish. And yet, clearly they would still take on bigger animals when they had the opportunity, which also adds support to the idea that other large shastosaurids would feed on marine reptiles when they had the chance to. Unfortunately for this poor old Ichthyosaurus, it died very soon after swallowing the reptile, as indicated by the lack of acid etching on the thalattosaur, meaning the stomach acid didn't have long to act on the bones. In addition, the paleontologists hypothesized that the detached head of the predator might have something to do with its death, suggesting that something quite awful happened to this poor ichthyosaur and it may have bitten off a lot more than it could chew. So the shastosaurids as a group are fascinating animals, and the possibility of these ichthyosaurs being the biggest animals that have ever lived is very exciting to think about. We definitely need to keep searching for more fossil remains of these animals so that we can learn more about them and develop our still relatively limited understanding of these magnificent creatures. Indeed, as the authors of the Ichthyotitan paper say, they encourage anyone who may have found more giant Triassic fossils that they think could have come from one of these titanic ichthyosaurs to please contact the authors in case they have another piece of Ichthyotitan.
And so finally, do you think there's more Ichthyotitan out there to be found?
I really hope so. I really hope so. When we were originally finishing up the manuscript and we were waiting for the final reviews, I actually had an email come through via Paul de la Salle of somebody else, another private collector, who was just walking on the beach along the Somerset coastline, and they spotted another chunk of bone.
Oh, cool.
So there is at least something else out there, and I'm very, very confident we will find more of other Ichthyotitans in time. The fact that we have, now we've got 2, and that literally was a direct result of our first paper coming out and the publicity around it. The fact we've got this worldwide interest now, and obviously global interest in the recent research, I'm pretty confident that we will have more, in the future.
That's great.
Yeah, I'm excited for it, because the other thing is, we already knew from the location like at Orst, we had big vertebrae, like 20 centimeters across, of ichthyosaurs, and just nobody put 2 and 2 together, and then now you've got this new material, and it's like, very clearly ichthyosaur.
That's cool.
So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we can do that. In fact, it makes a lot of sense to actually quickly show you that it's very, very relevant to this video. I brought this along with me, a mini version of the Serengula.
So cool.
Yes, this was the first one found by Paul de la Salle in 2016.
Wow.
And so obviously this is the tiny version of it. The 3D printed version done by Stephen Day, and that would be, the entire thing, as we know from the second one, is about there. And then you had the rest of the bones. You're talking this is right at the back of jaw, probably here. That would have been an enormous skull, 3+ meters easily.
They are such cool animals.
3-4 meters or so. Really incredible.
Wow, oh, thank you. That's so cool. Yeah, so I mean, anyone who's interested in fossil hunting better get out there and find the rest of it.
Absolutely, please.
So cool.
Please do.
Yeah, and let Dean know if you do.
Yeah, definitely. That's one of the big things we said in the first paper as well, and on the second one, is like, if anybody does find more material of any of these giant ichthyosaurs, we'll be really, really excited to discover more. So,
Awesome.
pleasure to chat to you, Ben. Yeah, as always.
I'd like to say a big thank you to Dr. Dean Lomax for doing this interview with me, and for describing such an incredible ichthyosaur. I'll put links to all of Dean's socials in the description below. Do be sure to follow him for lots of exciting ichthyosaur science and other paleontological content. And you can also check out his amazing books, especially Locked in Time, which I reviewed a couple of years ago. This book takes you through 50 incredible real fossils that preserve evidence of prehistoric behaviour, from dinosaurs locked in a battle to the death, to the tragic tale of the Psittacosaurus babysitter. It's an excellent read that I would highly recommend, and I'll link to it below as well. Anyway, I really hope we find some more complete remains of these amazing ichthyosaurs in the coming years. It's been a very exciting part of paleontology to follow. I hope you've enjoyed learning about these remarkable ichthyosaurs, and thank you so much for watching this video.